Hello, this is a little bit of an impromptu video. I was thinking about some of the stuff that I do in leadership development. One of the main things being talking to people about feedback and how to gather feedback. And it got me thinking about my years of feedback. And in my practice and in my work and in my public speaking and in my facilitation, we constantly ask for feedback. And it's good practice, it's best practice to do so. One of the things that I've learned though, as a woman, presenting and holding space in a room, and as somebody who may know the area I'm speaking about very well, or may not feel a deep responsibility for how other people experience it. So I understand in my work that I bring something and then people have to react to it, and that's where the learning happens. Sometimes that reaction is that they like it, sometimes that reaction is that they don't. But that reaction is where the learning actually starts. It's not in liking me, it's not in me presenting well, it's not in me asking the right question or appeasing the group or giving people what they want. It's actually in the space between me and them, where I bring something and they respond. And one of the things that I've learned about feedback, and I've learned about feedback in the public space, and I say as a woman very specifically, I'll tell you why. I look at loads of 360 reviews for men and women in leadership positions. I develop 360 reviews with men and women in leadership positions. And so I know how feedback looks. I see both feedback to men and women, and like the spectrum of human experience is very diverse and different. But there is something that I've seen. And then I went and looked at the research because I was thinking, is this my bias? Is this my avoidance? Is this me? So I went and I had a look. And it's really clear that we give feedback to women about who they are, whereas we give and about what their behaviors mean about them more than we do to men. And I was thinking, all right, okay. And then I was saying, oh, sure, maybe that's men doing that to women, but actually it's all of us. And there was no gender difference in those feedbacks. It doesn't matter who it's coming from. What tends to happen is it takes a particular tone or a particular angle at women. And I'm not even talking about the intersectionality of this. So a woman of color, women from different social class backgrounds, women with disabilities, like all of that, like that intersection has an impact. But I'm just going to talk about the very high level men and women, cis men and women feedback. And one of the things that I've learned about feedback in my own life is that people tend to be happy to give you feedback about your behaviors, which is something we encourage in leadership development. And with women, and I've seen this in other reports and in the research, we tend to police women about their personality and who they are. And we tend to have opinion on that. So we equate a behavior to something about them as a person. Whereas with men, we equate it to their behavior. So an example would be when women are aggressive, we say that she's aggressive and she needs to tone it down. But when men are aggressive, we see comments like when he's under pressure, if he's having a hard time, we see that understanding of the situation and the context. But what we see in feedback about women is about their personality, about who they are. And it got me thinking about my feedback over the years, because I've had to do an awful lot of 360 reviews for my training as a coach, and then for organizations I've worked with. And then I constantly get feedback about the work that I do. And I'm starting to see that the types of feedback I want and I appreciate are feedback about what happened for people in response to me. So that trigger that I talked about, so I did something, I taught something, I questioned something, I facilitated something, I challenged something, and then someone tells me about the impact that had on them. That is brilliant feedback, because I can learn about how my behavior and my way in the world impacts another person, and then I can choose to edit it or change it. The feedback that I've started to decide that I'm not going to take on board is feedback about me as a person in a work context. So I'm going to give you an example. I was at an event, I think I spoke for about 300 people in front of me, and out of 300 people, one person decided to come and give me feedback. And it was done anonymously, so I have no way of knowing who it was or having a chat with them about what the impact was for them. But the feedback wasn't about the impact for them. It wasn't about the content. It was about how I spoke. And when I say how I spoke, the feedback was that I was authoritarian in when I spoke about something. And I think that's really interesting, because I was invited to speak as an authority on the topic, and I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. But because it's anonymous, I can't have that conversation with the person. I can't find out what was triggered for them and then decide if that was my stuff or that was theirs. So it got me thinking about all that type of feedback where people are given the opportunity to tell us, and that can be leaders, facilitators, trainers, coaches, to tell us about us, and how it doesn't always take into consideration where it's coming from. And I've been noticing in the 360 reviews that I do with leaders across different organizations, usually multinational and global organizations, and thinking about how the culture of the organization informs the feedback, how the expectations of the organization inform the feedback, and the unconscious bias that lives within those expectations. And also how we have been taught to take feedback, but we haven't necessarily been taught to be discerning about it. And what I've learned is that feedback is socialized. So the feedback I'm getting is very much because I'm presenting as a woman. It's very much linked to what's perceived about me being white, my age, all of these unconscious bias pieces. And then people have an expectation, and their feedback is about that expectation of me. And what I find interesting is I have never seen feedback for a male that has said he has too much authority, he spoke with too much authority. I have actually seen that with women. So that experience for me, and that experience is about a year old now, it's not about that experience, but it's about bringing my point that actually I then had to go and review, how am I giving feedback to women? What am I talking to women about? What am I projecting onto them based on how I'm socialized? And are we teaching men and women to discern their feedback? So are men being taught to discern their feedback, that sometimes there will be an acceptance of unacceptable behavior because we do that in society, and that sometimes they won't be called out on their behavior soon enough, and that's how we find escalations within organizations. And then it got me thinking to the other side of that. Do we expect women to take on this feedback and respond to it in a kind of accepting manner, or do we expect them to discern it and to decide what parts of that is socialized and what parts of that is actually helpful to them? Because not all feedback is helpful. If I'm speaking, I'm just using this as an example, but if I'm speaking as an authority on something, then I kind of have to take up my authority on the topic. And I understand that might jar with people because they might not want me doing it. They might not like the look of me. They might not like my tone. It might trigger stuff for them. And all of that is okay. And that's the stuff I like to hear about. What happened for you so I can learn from the impact. But a lot of anonymous feedback is about what you should do differently. And I'm going to think about my feedback processes because I'm not interested, and I don't mean I'm not interested in what I should do differently, but I'm interested in why you think I should do that differently. Because I think that is the crux of feedback, is whose needs are being met and what are those needs? And are those needs reasonable to expect of the person you're giving feedback to? And so it's got me thinking about how we look at that more readily and how we discern around feedback and what feedback I'm going to accept or not accept. So if anyone lives on Twitter, I've had some negative experience on Twitter where now I don't use it that way. I've noticed that if I publicize something, I can get feedback about people disagreeing with me, which is fine. That's really normal. But this notion that because they disagree with me, I should change my mind, or because they disagree with me, I'm wrong. And I guess in the inclusion work that I'm doing, it really is brought to the forefront. Our ability to be with ourselves and to be with difference is central to inclusion, and to be with different opinions. Whereas what I'm noticing is that we look at feedback and we look at it through a one-dimensional lens, which is this is what we should be. And again, if you think of it from a counselling point of view, it brings our attention back to an external locus of control, when actually we need an internal locus of control that's informed. So I need to understand how people are experiencing me and the impact I'm having. That's important. But when I'm being told what I should do, or I'm being corrected or directed, that doesn't necessarily tell me the need I'm meeting or where it's coming from. Is it society, and do I really want to respond to that? Is it really about improving my performance or helping someone feel comfortable with me? That might not be my stuff. And we need to be more discerning around feedback. So that's what I wanted to say about feedback, and about thinking and discerning about feedback, and understanding that feedback exists within a context and a situation, and that context and situation isn't that people should have a right to judge us or define us, but that people should be able to tell us about the impact we've had on them and help inform us, which isn't necessarily how I see feedback happening at the moment. And in an inclusive organisation or group, feedback would be about the experience of the person giving feedback and their needs, just like is in relationships, rather than be about what's wrong or what the other should do differently. It would talk about what's happening for that person who's giving feedback to help inform the person rather than direct or define the person receiving the feedback's behaviour. Just something I think is interesting that we should think about more.